Okay guys, welcome back to the how-to series. Today we're going to be covering tempo, where it fits in a training program and understanding its prescription to maximize your gains. So straight away, tempo refers to the 4 phases within any given movement. This typically is a lifting, lowering and 2 holding phases dependent upon the exercise, and this will obviously determine its order, okay? Tempo matters when tempo matters. This is something that will make sense later on in the video. So as we said, typically there is a holding phase, an eccentric phase, a holding phase again, and then a concentric phase. Now, most exercises, okay, they start with a holding phase simply because of how we actually execute movement. Think about a squat, you unrack, you walk back, and then there is an initial holding phase before you go into the exercise. Now, for the purposes of the training program, okay, that would typically mean there is 4 numbers, but most of the time, the holding phase at the start of the movement, the joints are stacked and there is minimal metabolic cost, so we don't actually prescribe that particular phase. So it's not included. We're more interested in the eccentric, isometric and concentric phases of the lift itself. Now the tempo prescription, the first number is the first phase, okay? Now depending on what reference you look at, it will determine how this actually takes place. But within the JTS system, we keep it nice and simple. The first number is the first phase that pertains to that specific movement. It's always in order of the execution, okay? Without fail. So if it's a deadlift, the first number refers to the concentric phase because we start by lifting the bar. If it's a bench press, however, the eccentric phase is the first thing that takes place. So it will be determined by the movement you're doing. It's always an order of execution. It's always listed as 3 individual numbers separated by a dash in between. If there is an X in place, it just refers to being explosive. So X for explosive. Typically, again, within a deadlift, if it says X03, it means you need to lift as explosively as you can at the start of the movement, minimal holding phase at the top, and then 3-second lowering phase afterwards. So let's use an example with Dan Bell. He's the current all-time world record holder, arguably one of the strongest powerlifters to ever walk the planet. This is a squat from his recent meet at the time of recording this video. It's 500 kilogram squat. And what I want you to do is just simply watch the video. It'll also give you some motivation going into the training session and see if you can determine before we show you what the tempo would be written down as. Okay, so just watch the movement. Again, we're ignoring the first phase. We're starting from the eccentric phase. There's an isometric phase briefly there, and then the concentric phase itself, okay? So how would you have seen that tempo prescribed? How would you have written it down if we were obviously prescribing the tempo? Now, typically in those scenarios, he just does what's most natural, which is something we'll cover in a moment. But if we were to have prescribed the tempo for that movement, it should have come out as following. 2 seconds on the eccentric phase, 0 seconds in the pause, there was no distinctive pause, and then an X for lifting as explosively as possible because it was such a maximal weight. So a couple of rules and recommendations for understanding and implementing tempo within your training. If in doubt, go slower when you lower, okay? The actual tempo within an eccentric phase is quite important. There's a plethora of benefits that you can gain from it. However, the research has shown, and just anecdotally doing it yourself, you'll know that 3 seconds when you are lowering a really, really heavy weight all of a sudden becomes 2 seconds or 1 second. Time is relative within exercise. If you're not sure about that, just do the plank and you'll know what I mean 30 seconds later. We rarely use a slow tempo on the concentric, okay? Now, this is rarely, doesn't mean we never do it. We only really implement tempo on a concentric phase when we're learning a movement, trying to increase exertion whilst controlling load, but typically the tempo is more common within the eccentric or isometric phases because they bring benefits without actually reducing the load quite the same as when we control a concentric. And again, just think through the order, okay? If you're ever unsure, just think about the movement before you do it. Is there a lowering phase first or is there a lifting phase? And again, just check the tempo, think through first before you actually execute. But wait, what if it doesn't actually list the tempo, okay? So referring back to that earlier comment, tempo matters when tempo matters. What if it doesn't list a tempo? Control and what feels natural, okay? So provided you have control of the weights, because that's something we always want to prioritize, not necessarily control in the form of staying safe, although that is obviously a really important aspect, but more in the standpoint of making sure that you have control of the weight to maximize your performance and do what feels natural, okay? For most people, for the vast majority of the population, it doesn't feel natural to go slow on the lifting phase of a deadlift. Most people want to get it done because it's such a powerful movement. Keeping that in mind, the last thing, we want to prioritize control over what feels natural. For a beginner, most of the time, it will feel more natural to bounce in the bottom of a squat to get that stretch reflex because it is actually quite difficult to have starting strength at the bottom of the movement. but we want to prioritize control over what feels natural, although they're both quite important. So that's tempo. Just a quick summary before you start your session. Tempo, the numbers are always listed in the order of execution dependent upon that specific movement. It's always 3 numbers that pertain to the isometric, eccentric and concentric phases. Again, that's determined by the specific exercise. If in doubt, go slower when you lower and think through the order of the movement before you do it. As always, stay strong and I'll see you on the next one.